Picture this. A grown man in his 50s, wearing a cheap polyester blazer and clutching a clipboard like it's his lifeline, literally sprinting across a parking lot to avoid a conversation. Behind him, a calm, well-dressed attorney is simply walking at a normal pace, briefcase in hand, not even trying to catch up. The man in the blazer trips slightly, recovers, and disappears behind a dumpster like he's running from the FBI. This isn't a scene from some comedy movie. This is what happens when bullies who hide behind bureaucracy finally meet someone who knows how to fight back legally. This is what happens when cowards who abuse their tiny slice of power suddenly realize they might actually face consequences for their actions. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying examples of HOA karma you will ever see. Because what you're about to hear is the true story of how Marcus Rodriguez turned the tables on the most vindictive, petty, and ultimately cowardly HOA board in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why these so-called community leaders would rather hide behind garbage bins than face the music they'd been orchestrating for years. Marcus Rodriguez had always been the kind of guy who just wanted to live his life quietly. At 38, he was a software engineer who worked mostly from home, paid his bills on time, and genuinely believed that being a good neighbor meant minding your own business unless someone actually needed help. When he bought his modest 3-bedroom house in the Sunset Ridge community in 2019, he thought he'd found the perfect place to settle down with his wife, Elena, and their 2 young kids. Sunset Ridge wasn't fancy by Phoenix standards. Built in the early 2000s, it was one of those middle-class developments that attracted young families, retirees downsizing from bigger homes, and working professionals who wanted a quiet neighborhood without breaking the bank. The houses were well-maintained but not extravagant, with small front yards, 2-car garages, and that generic southwestern architecture that dominated the area. What Marcus didn't realize when he signed those closing papers was that he was moving into what could only be described as a bureaucratic nightmare masquerading as a homeowners association. The Sunset Ridge HOA wasn't just strict. It was run by people who had apparently confused community management with absolute monarchy. At the center of this petty kingdom sat Harold Whitman, a 62-year-old retiree who had been HOA president for 7 consecutive years. Harold wasn't retired by choice. He'd been laid off from his middle management position at an insurance company. He had apparently decided to channel all of his frustrated authority into terrorizing his neighbors. He was the kind of man who measured his grass with a ruler and kept detailed notes about everyone else's property violations in a leather-bound notebook that he carried everywhere. But Harold wasn't working alone. His right-hand enforcer was Janet Pearson, the HOA secretary-treasurer, a sharp-tongued woman in her late 50s who seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding new ways to fine residents. Janet had moved to Sunset Ridge after a nasty divorce and appeared to have decided that if she could not control her ex-husband, she'd settle for controlling everyone else in the neighborhood. Rounding out this trio of petty tyrants was Dennis Crawford, the vice president, a man whose main qualification for the position seemed to be his willingness to agree with whatever Harold and Janet decided. Dennis was retired military, but instead of using his discipline and leadership experience to serve his community, he'd apparently embraced the worst aspects of arbitrary authority without any of the honor that should come with it. Now, here's what made this HOA particularly insidious. They weren't breaking any laws, technically. They were interpreting every rule in the most punitive way possible and creating new restrictions whenever they felt like flexing their power. The community had 47 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, known as CCNRs, and this board treated them like holy scripture that could never be questioned. For the first 2 years Marcus lived in Sunset Ridge, he managed to fly under their radar. He kept his lawn neat, parked his car in his garage, and didn't do anything that would attract attention. He'd heard rumors from neighbors about the board's aggressive enforcement tactics, but like a lot of people, he figured that if you just followed the rules, you'd be fine. That naive assumption was shattered on a Tuesday morning in March 2022. Marcus had been dealing with a slow leak in his kitchen faucet for weeks, and he'd finally decided to tackle the repair himself rather than pay a plumber for what seemed like a simple job. He'd watched YouTube videos, bought the necessary parts, and figured he could handle it over the weekend. What he didn't anticipate was that the problem was more complex than he'd thought, requiring him to shut off water to part of the house and leave his kitchen partially disassembled while he ordered a different part. So there he was on that Tuesday morning, kitchen sink pulled away from the wall, cabinet doors open, tools scattered on the counter, waiting for a part that was supposed to arrive that afternoon. He was working from his home office when the doorbell rang. Standing on his front porch, clipboard in hand and wearing an expression of barely contained glee, was Janet Pearson. Behind her, taking notes on a tablet, stood Dennis Crawford. Harold wasn't with them, but Marcus would later learn that he was sitting in a car at the end of the street, coordinating this little expedition via walkie-talkie. Janet's voice had that particular tone that immediately puts you on the defensive, sickeningly sweet on the surface but dripping with condescension. She explained that they were conducting a routine inspection of the community and had noticed that Marcus's kitchen window had been covered with cardboard from the inside, which violated the community's exterior appearance standards. Marcus tried to explain about the plumbing repair, how the cardboard was temporary, how the part would arrive that day, and everything would be back to normal by evening. He even offered to let them see the work area, thinking that any reasonable person would understand. But reasonable people don't become HOA enforcement officers for fun. Janet informed him that, temporary or not, the violation existed and therefore a fine would be issued. $50 for the first day and an additional $25 for each day it continued. She handed him a bright orange violation notice, complete with photos they'd apparently taken of his window and a copy of the relevant section from the CC&Rs. Now, here's where Marcus made his first mistake. He tried to reason with them. Stay with me here, because this is where things start to get really interesting. He pointed out that the CC&Rs mentioned reasonable temporary measures for home repairs. He noted that several other houses in the neighborhood had various contractors' signs, equipment, or temporary coverings that weren't generating violation notices. He even offered to replace the cardboard with something more aesthetically pleasing, if that would resolve their concern. Janet's response was to flip through her clipboard and inform him that she didn't make exceptions, that rules were rules, and that if he had a problem with the fine, he could appeal it to the board at their monthly meeting. Dennis nodded along like a bobblehead and made a note on his tablet. That was Marcus's introduction to what he would later come to understand was Harold Whitman's systematic campaign to identify and target any resident who might dare to question their authority. That kitchen window violation wasn't really about community standards or property values. It was about establishing dominance and testing Marcus's willingness to submit to their interpretation of the rules. Marcus paid the fine, $75 for what amounted to 3 days of cardboard in his window while he completed a legitimate home repair. He grumbled about it to his wife Elena, complained to a few neighbors who shared similar stories, and figured that would be the end of it. He couldn't have been more wrong. What Marcus didn't know was that Janet had added his name to what she called her watch list, a collection of residents who had shown any sign of pushback against HOA decisions. From that point forward, Marcus's property would be subject to extra scrutiny, creative rule interpretation, and what could only be described as systematic harassment disguised as community management. The next violation came 6 weeks later. The second violation notice arrived on a Friday afternoon in late April, and this one was so petty that Marcus actually laughed when he first read it. According to the HOA, his mailbox post was exhibiting signs of weathering inconsistent with community standards and needed to be repainted or replaced within 14 days. Marcus walked outside and stared at his mailbox. It was a standard black metal post with a matching mailbox that looked identical to every other mailbox in the neighborhood. Sure, it had a few tiny rust spots near the base where the sprinkler system occasionally hit it, but calling it a violation was like ticketing someone for having dust on their car. He took photos of his mailbox and then walked around the neighborhood, documenting at least 12 other mailboxes that showed similar or worse wear. Some had peeling paint, others had dents, and a few were clearly several years past their prime. But apparently those weren't violations. Only Marcus's mailbox was a threat to community standards. This time, instead of just paying the fine, Marcus decided to attend the monthly board meeting to address what was obviously selective enforcement. The monthly HOA meetings were held in the community center, a bland rectangular building that doubled as a polling place during elections. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, thinking there might be a crowd, but found only 3 other residents scattered across the folding chairs, facing a long table where Harold, Janet, and Dennis sat with their papers and notebooks spread out like they were running a corporate board meeting. Marcus had never seen Harold up close before, and he was struck by how the man seemed to take up more space than his actual size warranted. Harold had that aggressive posture of someone who'd spent years in middle management, shoulders squared, chest puffed out, speaking in the kind of measured tone that suggested every word was deeply important. He was wearing a navy blazer over a golf shirt, and he'd positioned himself at the center of the table like he was chairing a meeting of Fortune 500 executives instead of discussing mailbox paint with 4 neighbors. When Marcus raised his hand to address the mailbox violation, Harold's response was immediate and dismissive. The board didn't discuss individual violations at community meetings, Marcus was told. If he wanted to appeal a violation, he needed to submit a written request with supporting documentation, pay a $25 processing fee, and wait for a decision that could take up to 30 days. Marcus pointed out that he'd taken photos of other mailboxes in worse condition that were not being cited. Janet's response was to inform him that the board investigated violations based on complaints received from residents, and if Marcus wanted to report other mailboxes, he was welcome to submit those complaints through proper channels. It was a perfect catch-22. The board would only address violations that were reported, but they were clearly not investigating their own violations or those of residents who stayed quiet and paid their fines without complaint. The system was designed to punish anyone who pushed back while protecting those who submitted to their authority. Marcus paid the mailbox fine and repainted his post, but now he was paying attention to how the HOA operated, and what he discovered was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond strict rule enforcement. Remember how I mentioned this is where things get interesting? Well, buckle up, because Marcus was about to stumble into something much bigger than petty mailbox violations. The breakthrough came when Marcus started talking to his neighbors, not just casually over the fence, but actually documenting their experiences with the HOA board. What he found was a clear pattern of targeted enforcement that seemed designed to generate maximum revenue while punishing specific residents who had previously questioned board decisions. Take Mrs. Chen, a 74-year-old widow who lived 2 streets over. She'd received 17 violation notices in 8 months for things like excessive holiday decorations. She'd left Christmas lights up until January 15th. Unauthorized garden modifications. She'd planted roses in her front yard without approval. And improper waste container positioning. Her garbage can was 18 inches from the approved location. Each violation came with escalating fines, and Mrs. Chen had paid over $800 rather than fight what she saw as hopeless appeals to the same people who were issuing the citations. Then there was the Martinez family, who'd been fined repeatedly for their teenagers' friends parking on the street during parties. The CC&Rs limited street parking to 48 hours, but the board was interpreting this to mean that any car parked in front of the Martinez house for more than a few hours during a social gathering constituted a violation, even when the street had plenty of space and no one was being inconvenienced. But here's what really caught Marcus's attention. Families who didn't push back, who paid their fines quietly and never questioned the board's authority, seemed to have remarkably fewer violations. The Johnsons, who lived directly across from Mrs. Chen, had identical landscaping and similar property conditions, but had received only one minor violation notice in 3 years. Marcus started keeping a spreadsheet. Names, addresses, violation types, fine amounts, and most importantly, whether residents had ever questioned or appealed board decisions. The pattern was undeniable. The board wasn't just enforcing rules, they were running a protection racket disguised as community management. But the real smoking gun came when Marcus discovered the board's financial relationship with their property management company. Every HOA violation that went unpaid for more than 60 days was automatically referred to Southwest Property Solutions. This collection agency charged a 30% commission on any money recovered, plus additional fees for letters, phone calls, and legal filings. What Marcus found interesting was that Harold Whitman's brother-in-law owned Southwest Property Solutions. Now, this wasn't necessarily illegal, but it certainly explained the board's enthusiasm for issuing fines and their reluctance to approve appeals. Every violation notice was potential income for Harold's family, and every resident who fought back was cutting into that revenue stream. Marcus spent weeks documenting this information, creating charts and graphs that showed the correlation between enforcement patterns and financial relationships. He was building a case, though he wasn't sure yet what he planned to do with it. That decision was made for him in August 2022, when the board crossed a line that even Marcus hadn't anticipated. Elena Rodriguez had always been proud of her garden. She'd grown up helping her grandmother tend vegetables and flowers in Mexico, and recreating that connection to the earth was one of her favorite things about having their own home. Their backyard was a small paradise of tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowering plants that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. The problem, a violation notice arrived on a scorching Tuesday in August, was that Elena's cucumber vines had grown through the slats of their back fence and were now visible from the common area behind their house. This wasn't just petty, it was vindictive. The cucumber plants were barely visible unless you walked to the far end of the common area and looked specifically through the fence. They weren't damaging anything, they weren't creating any safety hazard, and they certainly weren't affecting property values. But according to Janet Pearson's interpretation of the landscaping rules, any plant material that extended beyond a resident's property line constituted an unauthorized modification of common areas. The fine was $200, with an additional $50 per day until the violation was corrected. Elena was devastated. These weren't just plants to her. They were a connection to her family, her culture, and her sense of home. The idea that someone could force her to destroy something beautiful and productive because it offended their sense of bureaucratic control felt like a personal attack. That night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything for the Sunset Ridge community. Instead of paying the fine, instead of cutting down Elena's cucumber vines, instead of submitting to what had become a clear pattern of harassment, Marcus decided to fight back. And he was going to fight back the way that people like Harold Whitman, Janet Pearson, and Dennis Crawford feared most, with legal expertise, documented evidence, and the kind of systematic approach that turns bullies into the cowards they really are. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was up against, and that meant digging deeper into the board's operations than any resident had ever bothered to do before. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks doing something that Harold's board never expected any resident to do. He actually read every single page of the HOA's governing documents, not just the CC&Rs that residents received when they bought their homes, but the corporate bylaws, the management agreements, the financial records that were supposed to be available for inspection, and most importantly, the legal requirements that the board was supposed to follow under Arizona state law. What he found was a board that had been operating with almost complete disregard for its legal obligations for years. According to Arizona revised statutes, HOA boards are required to hold annual meetings with proper notice to all residents, Maintain detailed financial records available for inspection, follow specific procedures for imposing fines, and provide clear appeal processes for disputed violations. Harold's board was failing on every single count. They hadn't held a properly noticed annual meeting in 4 years. Their financial records were incomplete and contained several questionable expenses, including payments to Southwest Property Solutions that weren't properly documented. Their fine procedures violated state requirements for notice and due process. And their appeal system was designed to be so cumbersome and expensive that most residents gave up. But the most damning discovery was in the board's correspondence files, which Marcus was legally entitled to inspect as a homeowner. In emails between board members, he found explicit discussions about targeting residents who caused trouble, strategies for maximizing fine revenue, and most shocking of all, a message from Harold to Janet that read, "We need to make examples of people like Rodriguez so others know not to question our decisions." Marcus had his smoking gun, but he also had a problem. Filing a lawsuit against the HOA would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Even if he won, there was no guarantee it would change the board's behavior or help other residents who were being victimized. That's when Marcus remembered something his father had told him years earlier. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't to fight them on their terms. It's to change the game entirely. Instead of suing the HOA, Marcus decided to do something that would terrify Harold's board far more than any lawsuit. He was going to replace them. Marcus's decision to run for the HOA board wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about fundamentally changing how power operated in the Sunset Ridge community. But he knew that simply announcing his candidacy wouldn't be enough. Harold Whitman's board had spent years rigging the system in their favor, and they weren't going to give up control without a fight. The first challenge was the nomination process itself. According to the HOA bylaws, candidates for board positions needed to be nominated at the annual meeting, which the current board had been avoiding for years. When residents asked about the annual meeting, Harold's standard response was that it would be scheduled when necessary, and that the current board would continue serving until new members were properly elected. This is where Marcus's research into Arizona state law became crucial. Under the Arizona Planned Community Act, HOAs are required to hold annual meetings for the election of board members, and if a board fails to schedule these meetings, any homeowner can petition the state to force compliance. Marcus filed that petition in September 2022, along with documented evidence of the board's failure to hold proper elections. Harold's response was predictable. He tried to schedule a rush annual meeting with minimal notice, hoping to limit attendance and maintain control. But Marcus was ready for this tactic too. He'd spent months building relationships with other residents who the board's enforcement practices had victimized. When the meeting notice went out with only the legally required 14 days' notice, Marcus's network was prepared to spread the word throughout the community. The annual meeting was scheduled for October 15th at 7 p.m. in the community center. Harold clearly expected the usual turnout of 5 or 6 residents, but what he got instead was a crowd of over 60 homeowners, many of whom had never attended an HOA meeting before, but had been personally recruited by Marcus and his growing coalition of fed-up neighbors. The meeting started normally enough, with Harold reading through financial reports and committee updates in his usual self-important tone. But when the time came for board nominations, Marcus stood up and announced his candidacy for president, along with 2 other residents, Maria Santos and Bob Kumar, who were running for secretary-treasurer and vice president positions. Harold's face went through a remarkable series of expressions as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just one disgruntled resident causing trouble. This was an organized challenge to his authority. Janet Pearson immediately began flipping through procedural manuals, looking for ways to disqualify the nominations. At the same time, Dennis Crawford sat silent, apparently overwhelmed by the crowd of residents he'd spent years intimidating with violation notices. Now, here's where things got really interesting, and where you start to see the true character of these so-called community leaders. Harold tried to control the nomination process by claiming that candidates needed to submit detailed financial disclosures and undergo background checks before they could be considered. This was complete nonsense. Nothing in the bylaws required anything beyond basic nomination and a simple majority vote. But Harold was clearly betting that most residents wouldn't know enough about the rules to challenge him. Marcus was ready for this too. He'd brought copies of the actual bylaws, along with relevant excerpts from Arizona state law. When Harold started making up requirements, Marcus calmly read the actual procedures directly from the governing documents. The contrast was striking. Harold blustering and making assertions, Marcus citing specific legal text and page numbers. But the real turning point came when Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow who'd been harassed with 17 violation notices, stood up during the public comment period and began reading from a prepared statement about her experience with the board's enforcement tactics. Mrs. Chen had brought documentation of every violation notice, every fine, every communication she'd had with the board over the past year. She read specific examples of the pettiness she'd endured, being fined for having her newspaper delivered to her driveway instead of her porch, receiving violation notices for excessive bird feeding because she enjoyed watching cardinals at her window feeder, and being threatened with lien proceedings because she'd been 3 days late paying a $25 fine for a garbage can placement violation. As Mrs. Chen spoke, you could see Harold becoming increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't the controlled environment he was used to, where individual residents would slink into meetings, hat in hand, hoping for mercy from his bureaucratic authority. This was public accountability, and Harold clearly had no idea how to handle it. When Mrs. Chen finished, other residents began sharing their own stories. The Martinez family talked about being fined repeatedly for their teenagers' friends parking on public streets. A military veteran named Tom Bradley described receiving violation notices. At the same time, he was deployed overseas, then returned to find his house threatened with foreclosure for unpaid fines on violations he'd never seen. Maria Santos explained how the board had tried to prohibit her from installing a solar panel system that was clearly protected under state law. For over an hour, residents documented a pattern of abuse, selective enforcement, and financial exploitation that painted Harold's board as exactly what they were: petty tyrants who'd confused community service with personal power. Harold's response to all of this testimony was to bang his gavel repeatedly and announce that the meeting was running long and needed to conclude. But the residents weren't having it. Someone called out that they hadn't voted on board positions yet. Another person pointed out that under the bylaws, residents had the right to discuss community business at the annual meeting. That's when Harold made his fatal mistake. Instead of following proper procedure, instead of maintaining the pretense of democratic process, Harold announced that the current board would remain in place for another year and declared the meeting adjourned. He packed up his papers, gestured for Janet and Dennis to follow him, and walked toward the exit while residents were still speaking. The room erupted. Residents were shouting questions about the voting process, demanding to know how board members could declare themselves elected without any kind of vote. Marcus stood up and called for everyone to remain calm, but to also remain in the meeting room until the proper election process was completed. And that's when Harold made his second fatal mistake. He called the police. Now, calling law enforcement on a room full of your own neighbors who are trying to participate in a legal community meeting is bad enough. But Harold went further than that. When the Phoenix PD officers arrived, Harold tried to have Marcus arrested for disrupting an official meeting and inciting a disturbance. The officers, to their credit, quickly realized they were dealing with a civil HOA dispute, not any criminal activity. They asked Harold to explain exactly what laws had been broken, and Harold's response was a rambling complaint about residents not following proper procedures and showing disrespect for authority. One of the officers, a patient veteran named Sergeant Martinez, asked to see the HOA bylaws and listen to both sides of the dispute. After about 10 minutes of reviewing the documents and hearing testimony from multiple residents, Sergeant Martinez made it clear that no crimes had been committed and that the HOA needed to resolve its governance issues through proper legal channels, not through police intervention. Harold's face was bright red by this point. He'd just been publicly humiliated by his own neighbors, contradicted by the police he'd called for backup, and forced to acknowledge that his authority wasn't as absolute as he'd believed. Instead of trying to salvage the situation through compromise or proper procedure, Harold doubled down on his authoritarianism. He announced that since residents were clearly incapable of conducting themselves properly, the board would handle all future community business through written communications only. No more public meetings, no more resident input, and definitely no more challenges to board authority. This declaration was not only contrary to Arizona law, but it was also the moment when Harold revealed his true character to the entire community. This wasn't a man who'd made some mistakes in community management. This was someone who viewed his neighbors as subjects to be controlled rather than fellow homeowners with legitimate rights and concerns. Marcus realized that the situation had moved beyond simple board politics into something much more serious. Harold's board wasn't just incompetent or overly strict. They were actively violating their fiduciary duties and potentially breaking state laws governing homeowner associations. The next morning, Marcus made a phone call that would change everything for the Sunset Ridge community. He called Jennifer Walsh, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and had a reputation for holding rogue boards accountable for their actions. What happened next would prove that bullies who hide behind bureaucracy have good reason to be afraid of competent legal representation. Jennifer Walsh was exactly the kind of attorney that people like Harold Whitman have nightmares about. She'd built her practice on the principle that homeowners associations exist to serve communities, not to enrich board members or feed their power fantasies. She'd seen every trick that rogue boards use to maintain control, and she had an encyclopedic knowledge of the laws they routinely violated. Marcus met with Jennifer the following Wednesday, bringing boxes of documentation he'd collected over the previous months. Violation notices, financial records, correspondence between board members, attendance records from meetings, and most importantly, testimony from residents who Harold's enforcement regime Harold had systematically targeted. Jennifer reviewed the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd built a career on holding petty tyrants accountable. After 2 hours, her assessment was clear. Harold's board had violated numerous provisions of Arizona law governing homeowners associations, potentially exposing individual board members to personal liability for their actions. But Jennifer's approach to dealing with rogue HOA boards wasn't to immediately file lawsuits. Her first strategy was something much more effective. She would attend the next board meeting as legal counsel for concerned residents and give Harold's board a chance to comply with their legal obligations voluntarily. Now, this is where the story gets really satisfying, because Jennifer Walsh understood something that Marcus was beginning to appreciate. Bullies who abuse their authority are typically cowards when confronted by someone who actually knows how the system works. Jennifer called Harold Whitman's office. Yes, he'd set up an office in the spare bedroom of his house, complete with business cards that identified him as Community Management Director, and informed him that she would be attending the next board meeting on behalf of several residents who had concerns about HOA governance practices. Harold's response was immediate and telling. Instead of welcoming legal counsel to help ensure the board was operating properly, Harold tried to prohibit Jennifer from attending, claiming that only residents could participate in board meetings. When Jennifer pointed out that Arizona law specifically allows residents to bring legal representation to HOA meetings, Harold began backtracking, saying that attorneys would need to submit credentials in advance and follow special procedures. Jennifer's response was beautifully simple. She would see Harold at the next scheduled board meeting, which according to the bylaws should be the second Tuesday of every month, and she looked forward to helping the board address any compliance issues they might be experiencing. What happened next revealed everything you need to know about Harold Whitman's character and competence as a community leader. Instead of preparing for a productive meeting with legal counsel, instead of reviewing the board's practices to ensure they were following proper procedures, Harold decided to cancel the monthly board meeting entirely. His explanation to residents was that the board was reviewing community management procedures and would resume meetings at a later date. But Jennifer Walsh wasn't going away. If the board wouldn't meet voluntarily, she'd use the legal mechanisms available under Arizona law to force compliance with their obligations. The formal demand letter arrived at Harold's house on a Friday morning in November, delivered by certified mail and copied to every homeowner in the Sunset Ridge community. The letter outlined specific violations of Arizona's Planned Community Act, documented the board's failure to hold required meetings and elections, and demanded immediate corrective action. The letter gave Harold's board 30 days to comply with their legal obligations, including scheduling a properly noticed annual meeting, conducting board elections according to the bylaws, and providing residents with access to financial records and governance documents. Most importantly, the letter made it clear that individual board members could be held personally liable for damages resulting from their violations of state law, and that continued non-compliance would result in legal action that could include personal financial consequences for Harold, Janet, and Dennis. Harold's response to this letter would prove definitively whether he was a principled community leader who'd made some mistakes or a coward who'd been hiding behind bureaucratic authority to abuse his neighbors. His response was to immediately resign from the board and leave town for an extended vacation to visit relatives in another state. Janet Pearson lasted 3 more days before she also submitted her resignation, citing health concerns that prevented her from continuing her community service. Dennis Crawford, left alone on what had been a 3-person board, called Jennifer Walsh's office to ask what he needed to do to ensure compliance with state law and avoid personal liability. The Great Sunset Ridge. HOA reign of terror was over, ended not by violence or dramatic confrontation, but by the simple application of legal accountability to people who had never expected to face consequences for their actions. But the story doesn't end there, because Marcus Rodriguez had learned something important about how power works in communities, and he was determined to make sure that the Sunset Ridge HOA would never again become a tool for petty tyrants to abuse their neighbors. The collapse of Harold Whitman's board created a power vacuum that another group of residents with authoritarian tendencies could have easily filled. Still, Marcus Rodriguez had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. The coalition he'd built wasn't just about removing bad leadership. It was about fundamentally changing how the Sunset Ridge community governed itself. Within a week of the board resignations, Marcus had organized a community-wide meeting to discuss next steps. This time, the meeting wasn't held in the cramped community center under the hostile gaze of clipboard-wielding bureaucrats. Instead, it was held in the local park on a Saturday afternoon, with grills fired up and kids playing on the playground while their parents discussed the future of their neighborhood. The attendance was remarkable. Over 100 residents showed up, including many who had never participated in community activities before, but had been quietly suffering under Harold's enforcement regime. Mrs. Chen brought homemade cookies. The Martinez family organized games for the children. Tom Bradley, the military veteran who'd been harassed while deployed overseas, set up a registration table to make sure every household was represented. But the most meaningful moment came when Elena Rodriguez, Marcus's wife, stood up to address the gathered neighbors. She talked about what it meant to feel safe in your own community, to know that your neighbors were looking out for each other rather than looking for reasons to punish each other. She thanked everyone who had supported Marcus during the months when they weren't sure if fighting back was worth the stress and uncertainty. And then she announced that her cucumber vines, the ones that had triggered the final confrontation with Harold's board, had produced their best harvest ever that fall. She'd brought salsa made from those cucumbers to share with everyone, turning what had been a symbol of bureaucratic pettiness into a celebration of community resilience. The new board election was held in December 2022, with proper notice, transparent procedures, and actual choices for residents. Marcus was elected president by an overwhelming margin, but more importantly, the entire election process was designed to prevent the kind of authoritarian control that Harold's board had exercised. The new board implemented term limits. No one could serve more than 2 consecutive terms in any position. They established transparent financial reporting, with quarterly statements mailed to every household and annual audits by independent accountants. Most significantly, they created an independent appeals committee for violation disputes, ensuring that residents who disagreed with enforcement decisions would have their cases heard by neutral parties rather than by the same people who issued the citations. But the real change wasn't in the formal governance structures. It was in the community culture that emerged from the residents' successful resistance to bureaucratic abuse. The neighborhood block parties that had been discouraged under Harold's board became monthly celebrations. Parents organized supervised Halloween trick-or-treating for the first time in years. Mrs. Chen started a community garden in the common area, teaching neighbors about growing vegetables and sharing harvests with families who needed fresh produce. The financial impact of the board transition was immediate and significant. Under Harold's regime, the HOA had collected over $40,000 in violation fines in 2022, money that was supposed to be used for community improvements, but had largely disappeared into administrative fees and payments to Harold's brother-in-law's collection agency. Under Marcus's leadership, violation notices dropped by over 80%, not because rules weren't being enforced, but because the focus shifted from punishment to helping residents comply with reasonable community standards. Property values in Sunset Ridge increased by an average of 12% in the year following the board transition, outpacing similar communities in the area. Real estate agents began marketing homes in the neighborhood specifically because of the community's reputation for reasonable governance and neighbor-friendly policies. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was what happened to Harold Whitman himself. Remember, Harold hadn't just resigned from the board, he'd fled the state to avoid dealing with the consequences of his actions. But Jennifer Walsh's legal strategy had included personal liability claims against individual board members for their violations of state law, and those claims followed Harold regardless of where he chose to live. In March 2023, Harold was served with papers in Colorado, where he was staying with relatives, informing him that he was being sued personally for damages resulting from his abuse of authority as HOA president. The lawsuit sought reimbursement for all the improper fines he'd assessed, plus damages for the harassment and emotional distress his enforcement regime had caused.